like to thank the organizers for having this opportunity to talk with you after seeing, for most of you, after seeing the documentary film I made together with René Roelofs, also from the Netherlands. What I propose to do is to say a few words about the film, because there was no comment in the film, and it was a conscious choice, but still afterwards I think we can comment a little bit on the motives and the ideas behind this film, to do it the way we did it, and then to say, like for 30 minutes, something more general about my view of immigration history, to put the Dutch experience into a wider European and comparative view, comparing European and American immigration stories. So I will speak certainly not longer than till 8 o'clock. I will hope to squeeze it a little bit shorter. But let me start with 4 remarks about the film you just saw. One of the motives, if not the most important motive, was to make Europe visible to itself. That sounds a bit too grandiose, but in this specific area. But I think one of the problems in talking about Europe is that it's of course very divided along lines of language, history, etc. And that it's very difficult to create an image of what Europe is across borders. So to emphasize the similarity of what is going on in Malmö, in Amsterdam, in Marseille, in Bradford, in Frankfurt. And so there's a huge difficulty in gaining access to the archives in different European countries. France perhaps comes as a surprise, but France is by far the most open country and most accessible country when it comes to its audiovisual archive. The INA, the Institut National Audiovisuel, is really the avant-garde in Europe. I shall not go into technical details, but it's really very easy to access. Whereas the BBC is Eastern Europe 1953. Let's say 1957, but that's it. It's really completely closed. You cannot gain access to the archives of the BBC. You have to fill in a request and say, I want a scene about this and that, and then they say, we'll look for you. And also what came back was, for example, we had a request of a scene from a Newsnight, a conversation of Jeremy Paxman with the leader of the Arab European League, Abu Jaja, from Belgium, and they refused it simply with the argument, too sensitive, without any further explanation or whatsoever. If you go then to Sweden, they look at you in sheer astonishment. Why is anybody interested in historical material from Sweden anyway? Then you go to the broadcasting SVT, and they say, no, it's in the archives, the Royal Institute, this and that. You go to the Royal Institute, this and that, and then they say, no, you should go to the Swedish Broadcasting, because they have the rights and they have to give you permission. You go back and forth and back and forth, and so you lose 3 or 4 months in a very Kafkaesque communication. So it's not easy to gain access, and then you have the difficulty of the prohibitive cost. So in the beginning of the film you see 17 seconds of Margaret Thatcher, and the BBC wanted 5,000 euros for that 17 seconds. So you can imagine we didn't pay it in the end after long negotiations, because we had a lot of material from the BBC. But all in all, we spent 150,000 euros only for clearing the rights for a few European countries. So it's almost impossible in that sense to make Europe, through historical archives, visible to itself by creating an image of an ongoing story and across borders. So that was the first motive, to create an idea that we witness a common European, at least West European, North European story, which has a lot of things in common. Second motive was to create a story. Because if you witness the public debate in many European countries, not only in the Netherlands, but definitely also in France or Germany, there's a lack of historical knowledge, a lack of memory. Basically, most people don't have the faintest idea where the guest workers, the first migrants, why they came, how they were selected. So we thought it was so necessary to recreate a sense of memory, a sense of where it all began. And then to show, you know, an ongoing story, which we also wanted to tell in a way that there is nobody in the film that looks back. So normally you would have a documentary film where would be shown a piece of archive and then somebody sitting in a scene and saying, I can remember how cold it was when we arrived 30 years ago from Pakistan. It was horrible in the winter in Bradford, etc. And as a child I can remember this and that. We didn't want anybody to remember anything, but to recreate a sense of the flow of time, that everybody is caught in history, not knowing what will happen in 1 week, let alone not knowing what will happen in 2 or 10 or 20 years. So those who, for example, selected the guest workers for the Netherlands, there were no more than 60,000 guest workers in the Netherlands from Morocco and Turkey. And like all migration, it's a story of the myth of return. So people always thought, like the Polish migrants today in the Netherlands, we will be here for 5 years and then we go back. For most of them, that turns out to be a myth, because people are generally not going back. But anyway, out of these 60,000 guest workers of Moroccan and Turkish origin grew over years what will be a community of 1.2 million people in the Netherlands in 5 years from now. So there will be, or between 220 and 225, there will be 1.2 million with a Moroccan and Turkish background in the Netherlands. So 20-fold of what the original number of guest workers were. So it's a story of a lot of unintended consequences. There was no plan, there was no idea. It was simply, it began somewhere and then it evolved. And we wanted to retrace that story by showing it through the eyes of those who were in the process of living it. Third reason to make the film is a very basic idea, which if you come to think of it is almost banal, but not banal. If you look at most documentaries about migration, that it only tells the story of migration from the point of view of migrants. As if there was no country of arrival, as to say, if there were no native people witnessing the same story, living the same story. So we wanted to create a story about the interaction of newcomers and natives, and not treating the reaction of the natives only in terms of xenophobia and prejudice, but trying to be more subtle. Of course, you see scenes of xenophobia, but as I will explain a little bit later, my view of immigration is that you have to recreate the human experience of immigration from both points of view, from migrants' point of view, but also from the point of view of native populations, without immediately qualifying or disqualifying their reaction and attitude. The fourth and last motive to make this film the way we did it is that we wanted to emphasize the role of conflict. To show that all migration history, that is to say the story of migration that has a serious impact, not small groups, but large groups entering into society, that it's always a story of conflict. And that the conflict shouldn't be seen as the failure of integration, but as a sign of ongoing integration. So I have a very different view of the role of conflict. I'll explain it in a while. But the idea was to show that conflict is part and parcel of every major migration history, and that in that sense the whole discussion about French republicanism versus British multiculturalism is rather shallow, because if you look beyond all these models of integration, you will find very similar urban realities in Malmö, in Birmingham, wherever you look in Europe. So that is, those were the 4 basic ideas of the film. We've chosen not to edit any comment, first of all out of a conviction that most documentaries are completely filled with voice-overs, telling you how to see, what to see, which is strange, because the idea of film is show and don't tell. But most documentaries, if you come to think of it, are so crowded with words, and so directive in saying, you know, you should look at this. Of course, in the way we did the editing, in the way we composed scene after scene, there is of course an idea, but it's more subdued, and I hope it leaves open enough room to have an own explanation. At least what struck me in a lot of discussions we had after showing the film, also in school classes, that it led to very different reactions. Some people, you know, being very angry, saying you are legitimizing all kinds of anti-foreigner sentiments, others arguing exactly the opposite, and perhaps all is true. We will see. But you can, of course, in such a multitude of experiences and voices, you can take whatever you want and make it into a coherent story. But of course, it's a story about conflicting experiences, conflicting points of view. If I then go on to say something about my view on immigration. It starts simply with demography. And that is to say that, of course, if you look at worldwide migration, the increase of the last 40 years is very relative. In 1970, there were about 2% of the world population lived 1 year or longer outside of the country where they were born. Now it's 3.1%. So you can say it's basically a very relative increase in the number of migrants worldwide. And that is, of course, what we hear all the time. It's a very relative change, and why take it so seriously as a huge change in our society. But of course, it is a huge change if you look at specific countries in specific times. So if you look at Western Europe, there were in 1970 about 2 to 3% migrants in European societies, such as the Netherlands, France, Germany, Britain. And now it's 12 to 13%. In America, exactly the same. So there is a huge analogy, which is not often seen, between the demographic evolution of America, which between 1920 and 1970 almost had no immigration at all, very draconian anti-immigration laws, which were only softened in the mid-60s. And America, if you look at the composition of America, in 1970, 2% only of the American population were first-generation immigrants. Now it has grown into around 15%. So the demographic makeup of Germany, of the Netherlands, France, Britain, Sweden is not that different from America. America looks at itself as a nation of immigrants. We tend to have somewhat more difficulty in looking at ourselves in that way. But if you look at the demography, then you have to zoom in, because of course, cities like Amsterdam, like Malmö, like Marseille, now half of the population are immigrant families. So that is in one generation, of course, a huge change in the urban makeup of larger urban areas in at least our part of Europe. If you then zoom in further, look at schools, for example, 2/3 of school-going children in Amsterdam are from migrant families. So of course, for those who have school-going children, it's a huge change in everyday life. So that provokes, and that's the second step in my argument, that provokes uncertainty. For me, the uncertainty that is provoked by large-scale immigration is a given. The question is, of course, how are we going to understand that insecurity? I followed in my book and somehow in this documentary film a comparative approach by comparing European countries and also comparing European countries and the United States. I think if you really look at the story of migration in the United States, but also in many European countries, we have forgotten our history. To give just one example, there were 19 million Italians who migrated from Italy between 1870 and 1970. 19 million. 6 million went to the United States. We know all their stories, Godfather Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. But we know no story at all about Italian migrants in Marseille around 1900, who made a quarter of the population, etc. So we have very little knowledge. America more. We have very little knowledge of our migration history. But it doesn't mean that there is no migration history in many European countries already, much longer than the migration history of the United States. I mean, Amsterdam, to just cite one classic example, Amsterdam in the 17th century, already half of its population were immigrants. So, in that sense, it is important to compare American, European experiences. And then I draw two lessons from that comparison to squeeze the argument, which is of course a bit more nuanced, but to squeeze it into two main ideas. The first is that it's a deep misunderstanding of migration history to start with the slogan, migration is an enrichment for all of us. We simply don't understand anything about the real dynamics of migration if we start with this idea of enrichment. The human reality of migration is a reality, first of all, of losing something. Not of gaining something, but losing something. If we don't understand the loss that is entailed in migration history, I think we completely miss understanding what the dynamic of that story is. So why loss? Let's take the title from a recent novel, not so recent actually, of Kiran Desai, Indian American writer, The Heritage of Loss. If you really analyze the writings of migrants, the letters of migrants sent back home, etc., you always come across the theme of loss. How do I understand that loss? I think it's not so difficult to understand from the point of view of migrants that the story of migration is a story of losing a world that was known. If you leave everything behind you, you have to recreate life in a different language to begin with. So all migrants can tell you how difficult it is to find your way into a new language in which the emotional layers of that language are, of course, for a long time very difficult to understand. So the sense of imbalance, of insecurity that derives from losing the ability to express yourself in the language into which you were born is, I think, one fundamental. The second one, a mother from the Moroccan community in the Netherlands says to me, "I'm losing my child to your society." So the idea of many parents with a migrant background that it's so difficult to raise a child in a society into which they were themselves not born, not socialized, living with quite a different idea of how one should live, than raising children in a society to which their knowledge of that society, their access to the morality of that society is complicated. So the generational conflict is a classic phenomenon in all migration history, and that is a feeling of losing something. Many migrants have the feeling, I'm losing my children, I want them to become a success in the country of arrival, in this new country. But the moment they become part of this society and successful, the distance between me and my child grows, often to an unbearable extent. It's also about losing the self-evident nature of many religious rituals. Ramadan in the Turkish countryside is something completely different than Ramadan in the midst of Amsterdam. In the Turkish countryside, it has a cultural and natural context, it is woven into the fabric of everyday life. Whereas in Amsterdam, it, of course, it doesn't have a history, it doesn't have a context. And so to recreate a sense of belonging, a sense of religious affinity, is far more complex in this new environment than it was in a country of origin. So I think the conservatism of many migrants, which is a classic element, also for Dutch migrants in Australia or Canada, if I visit their homes, I'm back in the 50s. They speak a very antiquated Dutch. They are polite, which we definitely are no longer in the Netherlands. They are expressing themselves through all kinds of very strange anachronisms. They took the culture of the Netherlands with them, and it ossified in a way in the country of arrival. And that is true for Turkish migrants in the Netherlands. They are far more conservative than Turkey is today, because they cling to an identity which they see is slipping away. Now, what one should add is that there is also, of course, a mirror image almost among native populations, where there is also a sense of losing a world that was known. Nobody, or almost nobody, sees the arrival of a mosque in their neighborhood as an enrichment. We can all tell each other that people should see it as an enrichment. Most people don't. They see it as losing the distinctive characteristic of their neighborhood to a change which, at least at first, people don't welcome. To give you just an example which might be of interest in a country where Catholicism is still a relevant presence, to convey the idea of loss then from the perspective of autochthonous populations. When, rightly so, Muslims in Germany say, you confront us with the idea of the separation of state and church. So how come that in the public school where my child is going, that there is a crucifix on the wall? Either it's a public school, but then there should be no religious signs. And then the answer is, that's our tradition. And that is, of course, a nonsensical answer, in the strict sense. Either you say it's our tradition, but then why shouldn't others be allowed to instill their traditions in the same public sphere? Or you say there is a principle of the separation of state and church, but then you cannot confront others with an idea you're not willing to live yourself. So we see religious signs slowly but steadily in some public spheres disappearing, which is perceived by many in Germany, for example, as a loss. We're losing the Christian identity of our country. Yeah, and that is one of the consequences of migration. You're losing some of these traditions, at least, when they are part of the public sphere, in the sense that, for example, in Italy there are crucifixes in every courtroom. Yeah, you're going to lose them, I guess, if you want to live up according to your own principles. So I would say the conservatism, also in the reaction of native populations. Why is there such an upsurge of populism? Why is there such an upsurge of clinging to an idea of what it means, you know, French identity, British identity, Dutch identity, German identity, Flemish identity? It's exactly the mirror image of the conservatism of many migrants. That is to say, people feel that an identity is changing, that they're losing a certain identity, and they're clinging to it. So that is the first thing I learned from studying the migration history of Europe and America. Second lesson is that it's, of course, not a stable situation, in the sense that this sense of loss defines us from generation to generation. It's a first reaction. And so I think that we can understand, by studying the story of migration in Europe and America, that there is a cycle of integration. I now summarize a far more complex and messy reality into an idea, but I think we can understand the cycle of integration through 3 stages, which you can link to 3 generations. First, it begins with avoidance, by the denial, so to say, that something is changing. I will illustrate it in a minute, then you always see avoidance breaking down, because it's not possible to avoid each other in the long run, and spilling over into conflict. And the conflict I see, the non-violent conflict, there are also forms of violent conflict, but the non-violent conflict I see as a search for a new accommodation, a new compromise, a new way of really living together. So I see the conflict as the intermediate phase between avoidance, segregation, and new forms of accommodation and compromise which emerge over time. So you could say the first generation symbolizes avoidance, segregation. The second generation, the children, symbolize conflict. The third generation, the children of the children, are the living witness of a culture of accommodation. Now, of course, that's very schematic, because there are people living through this whole sequence in one generation. You have communities that after 5 generations are still very much segregated, so it's not an iron law. In democracies, happily, there are no iron laws at all. It's a work in progress. But I think we can recognize something of the post-war European history of migration by looking at these 3 phases and then comparing it to American examples. Segregation. There is no example of mass immigration without segregation. The areas where migrants start to live, mostly cheap areas, you see forms of what then later was called white flight, which is a deeply ironic term, because in my view it has not much to do with the color of one's skin, because in America there was white flight when Irish migrants arrived in Boston, or Italian migrants arrived in Chicago, or Polish migrants arrived in Chicago. White flight for white immigrants. Now we see black flight for white immigrants. In some areas where Polish migrants tend to congregate, we see Surinamese people leaving in the Netherlands. So black flight for white migrants. I think it has more to do with the dynamic of residents and newcomers. And that you see in areas where there's a lot of newcomers, that you see the original inhabitants leaving the area because they vote with their feet, they leave. That is a classic of all migration history. That is massive scale migration. There's simply no example of migration without forms of segregation. And segregation, you could say, is the physical expression of a culture of avoidance, of keeping to yourself.